every government is trying to invest in data centers and boost AI labs and development in this sector. Brazil is doing the same. UK is doing the same. Europe wants to do the same. I think India is also doing the same. But the bigger irony here is that in trying to establish your own investment, you're also at the same time increasing dominance on US tech.
Hi, this is Shashank,
Hi, I'm Fawaz.
and welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast.
Hi Ramsha, it's so good to have you on the podcast. Finally, very excited for you to be on. Why don't we start by asking you to introduce yourself and a little about the kind of things you've been writing about?
Hi, Shashank. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, thank you for inviting me. I'm Ramsha, as you said. I'm originally from Pakistan and I've been a journalist for a decade now. And I've been covering tech and human rights first on Pakistan. But now I've moved abroad and I've been looking into global trends in tech policy. So, now I work with Tech Policy Press as an associate editor. For those who don't know, Tech Policy Press is a media outlet focused on all things tech policy, as the name says. So, in my current role, I've been looking more closely at what's happening in Europe in terms of tech policy developments, but also the global impact of the US administration on civil society and this space in general. So, I'm happy to talk more about that as we go on.
Actually, yes, that would be a great place to start. The impact of the new US administration. You've been writing a lot about the US's impact on global digital rights. And as you know, it's this administration is barely 6 months old, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it. Could you help us walk through how the story is evolving?
There are many stories. It's almost difficult to catch up. And coming from our backgrounds, India, Pakistan, we're used to this much happening. But I would still say it is quite a bit, and it's very significant, the impact on not just tech policy, but the world. It's sort of the world order is shifting geopolitically. And the biggest story, at least from a tech perspective, that we've been covering is how tech regulations are no longer just about regulating platforms and speech, but more about geopolitics. So it's almost become, not even almost, it has become a political story. So that's number one. And the bargaining between Trump and them, and again, we can go into more details, but just in short, the Trump administration has been going against governments that are passing platform regulations and going after American companies. So, of course, the biggest battle is between Europe and US, mostly because Europe has been leading regulation in terms of tech in the past few years, but it's also increasingly other countries. So that's number one. Number two is, as I mentioned, the impact on civil society and the digital rights space. And it's not just digital rights, the impact of USAID funding that was rolled back significantly across the development sector. It's not looking good. But in the tech space generally, because digital rights is fairly a new industry, it hasn't been around for that long when you compare it with the rest of the development sector. So the impact has been so significant that it's not just that they're no longer able to do the work, but it's also how do you do work in this space when platforms have also changed their position on content moderation and speech. So that's number two. And then lastly, I would say is also generally US has been fundamental in leading a lot of pro-democracy work. And they played a big role in, for instance, advocating for rights respecting approaches, human rights within the tech space. And now with them, there's I mean, it's I wouldn't say they were always the best democratic example, but still a lot of in the world it mattered what US is doing and pointing to US as sort of a champion in this space. So now with that changing fundamentally within 6 months, there's this big vacuum of what is the point of rights respecting right now, and how do you do this work forward?
Okay, that's very interesting. And I was just wondering because you touched upon it for tech policy space or the digital rights space, what do you think has a greater impact? These funding cuts to various organizations or aid programs, or the normative shift which we are witnessing because of the change in behavior of the US, or how the US administration conducts itself, the language it speaks. From where you are sitting, what do you see as the greater shift?
I would maybe like reframing this question a little bit, because I think the issue is also very nuanced. So giving you a specific example, looking at Europe, for instance, Europe has been known for being a super regulator, as in passing so many tech regulations that within Europe it's difficult to catch up now with what's happening. And a lot of what's happening with the enforcement and implementation of these European laws are in part in a result of what's happened in the US. So you can say um, the Digital Services Act, which is Europe's primary online content rulebook, there hasn't been any major penalty against tech platforms under this law yet. As of now, it's expected that there will be against Twitter from like X over the summers, but at least not yet. And there have been talks that they will water down that fine and they will slow down enforcement, and that the act itself is losing teeth. So in a way, you can say this is in response to the shift in US, what's happened in the 6 months. But in other ways, you can also say that the deregulatory trend is global, and this retreat is not maybe a reaction to what's happened in US, but also each region has their own challenges. And I think what's happened now is those regions are becoming more and more aware of those challenges. At least speaking from Europe's perspective, there are many internal issues that they have to deal with, and they've suddenly become aware of all of it. And then looking outside as well, we've seen initially the push towards data localization in India, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and now they've pulled back some of that push for data localization as well. So globally, I think there's also in this time, of course, US is a big factor. And as I mentioned, Trump's close ties with tech owners and them aligning and all of that. But then there's also deregulatory trend that is happening all across the world.
Thanks, Ramsha. That feeds very well into the next topic that you've been writing about and which I wanted to explore with you. This is something that personally I've also been thinking about a lot, and speaking about is how the Brussels effect is playing out or changing. And this is in context of your writing on EU being a super regulator, and now it's shifting its approach to quote unquote simplifying its tech regulations. Your writing and work has recently captured that there are various pressures on the European Commission on why they maybe are thinking of this simplification. Of course, the US factor being one, but also a lot of push from local industry in Europe. I was reading your writing on pushes on them from creating European technology, for example, and innovation. So yeah, how are you seeing this shift in Europe, and what does it mean for um, other regions of the world, especially the global South and maybe South Asia?
I think the biggest impact of all of this is what happens to the Brussels effect. And Brussels effect was a term by Anu Bradford coined to say that Europe passing all these tech regulations will have a trickle down effect and other countries will follow. And we saw that other countries did follow with their GDPR, which is the data protection law, and now more recently with their AI Act and Digital Services Act and similar models. So now, when so many countries were looking towards Europe to set an example in tech regulation, and then Europe pulling some of those or thinking about watering down or simplifying these regulation, obviously, it's a big question not on what happens in Europe, but what happens globally, given so many countries were looking at Europe. That's number one. So what's happening within Europe, like I said, there are also a lot of internal challenges that are coming up. It's not just in response to US, it's just there's so many laws, as I mentioned. There are funding challenges, resource allocation challenges, and as fundamentally, there's always been this tension between Europe enforcing laws as Europe, as the European Union versus member states. It's not easy to implement any laws when you have 27 countries under the bloc. So that's the harmonization of laws is a big challenge as well. Like how do you ensure all countries implement the laws the same way? Um, and then the commission's role has become important because the commission was never a regulator per se before the Digital Services Act, and now it's become a regulator. So it's a new regulator, and it's also in a way the commission itself doesn't know how to do this right. It's also the law is very new, so there are also internal challenges, which are resource challenges, also not knowing what is the best way to do. With the AI Act conversations, a lot of it is that they're not ready. They don't know how to do this. So there are a lot of internal challenges that are pushing for this simplification push, but at the same time, it's also very real. Like you said, the industry's role. Lobbying was always a big issue in GDPR negotiations as well. And now the concern for a lot of civil society groups is if you open up these laws, then lobbying becomes even a bigger threat because it gives them room to influence these regulations. So there's a lot happening. It's a very complex story, but at the same time, I think the bigger question here is if Europe, the message Europe sends, if they, for instance, water down GDPR, they have made some changes already, and if they ro- pause enforcement of AI Act or make changes to the AI Act, the message this sends globally is what is the biggest concern.
Thanks, Ramsha. And I'm also thinking we've spoken about the US factor, but when DeepSeek came out from China, there was a bit of a scramble in the US as well. Do you see that playing out in Europe too? Is there a China factor influencing this shift from heavy pro regulation to innovation? Just wanted to pick your brains on that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it's all become competition now. Innovation competition they've moved from safety and human rights to a more competition based because of this competition against US, but also China, and trying to establish in the AI context, like everyone wants to be the leader. And what happened at the Paris AI Summit this year. All the conversation is focused on investing and development versus not focusing so much on safety aspects, which traditionally used to be Europe's position. And this simplification push that we've been talking about as well is in a way to boost competition and establish Europe as a leader in this space. So China is a big part, and of course the fears around China were always there. A lot of the tech sovereignty discussions happening in Europe right now to develop their own local solutions is because we don't want to rely on US, but we also don't want to rely on China. And DeepSeek, I think, was also banned in Italy and some countries. So, of course, the fears with China are still there. But at the same time, I think now it's going to be interesting to see what happens because a lot of the local conversation is like they're so anti-US right now that they're like we'd rather use Chinese chips over being dependent on US. And of course, this is an interesting because they've been so fearful, but the reality that China, for instance, produces so many chips, and the tech infrastructure is also US is dependent on China. You can't just put China out of the equation. So when the need arrives to establish yourself as a leader in this space, competition will also put putting your hands out to China.
Thanks. And what you've been highlighting for us is how the tech policy discussion is increasingly about geopolitics. It's not just tech policy. When we're discussing tech policy, we are increasingly discussing geopolitics. And as you were talking about China, tech sovereignty is not just something that the Chinese talk about. It's across the board. We see a lot more countries asserting their sovereignty when it comes to the digital space. I'm wondering what that means for South Asia, especially given the fact that you followed this space for so long. And it's not, I know South Asia isn't one homogeneous space to speak of, but still there are a number of similarities across the board. And when you look at the region today, in these shifting geopolitical realities, what hits you and what do you think the impact is going to be on the tech policy space?
I think firstly, funding is a big issue. I don't, if, in Pakistan, for instance, a lot of fact checking work is completely vanished because of the funding issue. And especially with the recent conflict, I was speaking to an organization, Media Matters for Democracy, that was establishing fact checking and also training a lot of journalists in newsrooms. They said that we've lost all funding. We can't do this work anymore. So media literacy has struggled. And at the same time, digital rights space, as I mentioned, was so reliant on Western donors, and not just Western donors, but also platforms. So, for instance, when Meta pulls back their fact checking commitments, the trickle down effect is obviously global. But also, generally, working in this space is sensitive because your relationship with the government is so tough, right? So you can't rely on government funding, and now you can't. And a lot of the work that you did was benefiting from international allies, intermediaries who would put you, help you support your advocacy on local issues. When you lose that support, it becomes very difficult to do advocacy in this space because you're already working in a very tense and sensitive environment. So I think that's very valid for South Asia, given the space we work in. Um, in terms of policies going forward, like I said, the data localization retreat in India, for instance, is a good example to look at the deregulatory trend. But then at the same time, this desperation um, to regulate online content, that's still there. In fact, it's in many ways more than it's ever been. But what will change, and this is not rest of South Asia, I think India has always been a sole player where they have a relationship with tech platforms, the size of market, all of those things contribute. So X's case against India, for instance, is very significant because previously, X had a very different stance to dealing with moderation in India, but most recently we saw that they did decide to comply with the government. So that change of tone, I think, has happened since the Trump administration and this shift. And this also is going to be interesting to see going forward that will platforms work with governments more, and that relationship that was not as close before has changed. And this is very specific to India, of course. Rest of South Asia, I think Sri Lanka is actually an interesting space to see right now with their online safety bill. They proposed a very problematic, but now they've pulled it back and they're looking at revising it and doing broad consultations on what the right approach is. So I think it's difficult to bucket South Asia together as much as the West likes doing it because the regional challenges are so different in many ways and different direction, and the resource challenges. But I think broadly authoritarianism is a big concern still. In fact, even more. And then platforms, if they choose to comply with governments, is a red flag to watch out for.
Great. And Ramsha, I think what I'm also hearing is we're just living in such uncertainty. As you were pointing to, the Europeans also say, hey, this is so antagonistic with the US, maybe we should rely on Chinese chips, which again just changes the way we've looked at the world order as we've been talking about. That's also happening in India. You're mentioning about how India's pulled back on its strong data localization endeavor, but actually we started to see it creep in a bit again from the rules of implementation of the data protection law that are soon to be finalized from the government side. So I think that uncertainty aspect about which position governments will finally take is sort of impacting a lot of these conversations.
Yeah.
Just zooming out a bit from we've spoken about Europe, US, and South Asia. I know that, and as Fawaz was saying, other regions as well have been asserting that tech sovereignty. Um, what have you been noticing in Latin America and parts of Africa? We've seen that, especially in Latin America, there tends to be a strong Brussels effect, whether it's the DSA or the AI Act. But we've also started to see um, key functionaries and government functionaries, for example, in Brazil, have battles with Elon Musk
Yeah.
or the US sort of system. So, do you see in any way this global hegemony impacting regions in Latin America and Africa, and how you are sort of observing that?
So I think Brazil's case is very interesting, specifically given their recent pushback against X, but also Rumble, which is another platform, and that's something to watch out for because it's for a reason that Trump's administration went out attacking, saying that we will not allow foreign officials visiting US, foreign officials who are regulating online content from US companies. And Brazil is a very obvious choice here because they've been really going against US companies like X and, to challenge the overreach they have. But then at the same time, you will see this happened last week that the Brazil's Supreme Court overturned the current platform liability regime, saying that it was partially unconstitutional. So basically, the ruling was that social media companies can be held accountable for third party content deemed illegal even without court orders. So, this is a big development given Brazil's specific challenges. But I would say that these, and also from Africa, I mean, Africa, I would say, is on a downward path mostly because of the funding challenges. Like I pointed out initially, it's one of the most impacted regions because of funding. But Latin America, specifically Brazil's case, is, I think, an interesting one to show. I would say, in many ways, has shown more teeth so far than Europe in challenging tech companies. Of course, we are yet to see if that yields any results. It's too soon to say that. But the fact that they've continued on this path despite threats and besides the change of stance from U.S. government is an important one. On tech sovereignty, I think one thing that we're seeing globally is every government is trying to invest in data centers and boost AI labs and development in this sector. Brazil is doing the same. UK is doing the same. Europe wants to do the same. I think India is also doing the same. But the bigger irony here is that in trying to establish your own investment, you're also at the same time increasing dominance on US tech. Because, for instance, in Brazil's case as well, all these partnerships that we want to boost and our AI capacity and data centers, but then at the same time, you're literally inviting companies to come invest in your countries. So it's kind of an interesting say on one hand that you're trying to establish dominance, and on the other hand, you're also literally giving big tech more space to establish dominance. So that's another trend that's interesting and contradictory to watch. And then going to Africa, I think the problem with a lot of uh, this is also going to be interesting that I think for the past 2 to 3 years, there was a lot of this effort from regulators also working in the online safety space to harmonize and to, come together and see what can be done together. And now within the last 6 months, we've seen that every country is to their own adventure. In a way, there's no space to collaborate because everyone is like, we want to be the one establishing dominance. So what happens is countries like, for instance, regions like Africa or countries that don't have a lot of resources or are not the big players, they're left to their own challenges without the international support they need to improve. So that's very sad reality, and I think it's also an awakening call. Like, who are the you need to find new international allies to do this work forward.
Thanks, Ramsha. And we've been seeing some of that in India as well when we ask what does it mean to be sovereign in terms of technology, what does AI sovereignty mean, right? Like we India doesn't currently have a foundational model. We rely on hardware that's designed in the US and manufactured in Taiwan and China, and we're relying, as you're saying, we're relying on a lot of infrastructure that's primarily built by US companies, including data centers, like Amazon Web Services being a very prominent sort of player in providing data center services. So I think that's an interesting point to think about. I often wonder, Ramsha, when we're sitting in global meetings and there is this quote about the open, interoperable internet, right? What does that mean today? Right? That's sort of the traditional American, or I would say traditional way of saying that the web or the internet is open, interoperable, and safe. But as you are pointing to, we're seeing increasing fragmentation of the internet. What the internet looks like in India doesn't look like in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Europe, and in the US. So I wanted to pick your brains on how you are seeing this open, interoperable, safe internet. What does it mean according to you in today's reality?
I'm glad you asked this question because this is something I've been thinking about for a while, the consequences of having your local internet. And in many ways, it's one of the things that this space was critical of China for doing that, right? And having their own solutions, having their own version of an internet. And now, in a race to break free from US dominance, I feel like, especially Europe, for instance, is trying to establish. I've been seeing a lot of headlines, for instance, from Denmark and other countries to create their own Facebook or come up with their own solutions. And I feel like we're back to many years ago when probably this space was born, and it was as a result of the globalized internet, the way it works. So our challenges are the same. A lot of what we experience online harms, the way platforms moderate content is the same. So we should come together in the space for collaboration. But now when you're saying we should have our own sovereign tech and we should have our own local solutions, firstly, collaboration becomes difficult because then each region becomes focused on their specific challenges. And then they also have their own resources and politics to deal with. The second is also the consequences of data localization that I think a lot of these people who are saying promoting tech sovereignty are not very aware of. So, of course, tech sovereignty is one thing, and data extraterritoriality is another thing. So, just because you have, for instance, what I was saying about data centers as well, just because you have a data center in your own country, that does not mean that the what happens to the data that will flow out of your country, that's a separate issue. It's not going to automatically resolve that. So those fears of surveillance from US will not just go away because you have your own local center or data localization. And the one lesson we've learned from our context is that when governments have access to data and have more control over companies, that does not always result in the best case. It's not great for human rights work, and it gives them more access and surveillance powers and more control over how companies work. So, and then finally, one thing I've been saying in the European context, just because a company is European doesn't mean that it will necessarily comply with the laws. So these are just interesting four very quick reflections on this sovereignty debate and push to make things local. But also, I've been curious from India's example as well, because there was a momentum in India. And I mean, now also there are many local apps, and how that experience has been. I still don't see India breaking away from US tech, but also curious to hear what that experience has been.
I think there are a bunch of services that are very Indian. We have Zomato, Swiggy on the food delivery side, and now we're seeing a burgeoning impact on quick commerce, which is like 10-15 minute delivery. And it's always interesting when friends and people are visiting from outside, and they're like, hey, oh, can we, we want to eat Indian mangoes, and it's when they realize we can order them in 10 minutes to our doorstep. It's always an interesting experience, but it has created its own challenges behind labor questions. Some of our regions have some of the most harshest climate and weather conditions in the world, and we're sitting in Delhi right now. It's really hot, and what does it mean for the people who are actually collecting these groceries from the store and bringing it to your doorstep? So those kind of questions, and what autonomy do they have over their data? What autonomy do they have over their working hours is a very big question. I think just the gig economy question, whether it's quick commerce, whether it's food delivery, whether it's data annotation, I think there was a buzz in India talking about that. I think that buzz has gone down a bit, unfortunately. Especially on the data annotation front, I don't see a lot of conversation emanating from Indian society itself. I think it's still a hidden conversation, but and India is one of the largest contributors to data annotation. So, we do present ourselves as a talent pool. We do present ourselves as, having our own say in AI sovereignty. But the real reality of the situation is that we are big data annotators, and what it means for those people who are conducting those jobs. But yeah, Fawaz, do you also have?
Uh, yes, I mean, there is, as we've been discussing, the story of tech regulation, especially, or tech innovation, is not just about tech anymore, not just about digital rights anymore. It's just as in international affairs, it's much more about geopolitics. Domestically, I think now questions of labor, questions of who owns data, I think those are going to, and they are going to get litigated in the coming years. They are going to be fought in the political arena. So that's going to be interesting. I had a question that was a small tangent from this, which is, uh, as we are talking about localization, we are also talking about fragmentation of regulatory regimes, fragmentation of
Yes.
how states like India or other important states for the digital economy interact or bargain with big tech companies. So, in the context of this fragmentation, is it still useful to use the global majority as a lens? Is it useful to talk about a global majority perspective? Or is that also now, but we've seen G77, for instance,
Mhm.
trying to be a little active in forums like VISIS or in other, even during the GDC at some level. But is it still useful to use that lens, or uh, we would like your opinion on it? Yeah.
That's a big question. And an interesting one. I don't, firstly, to be very honest, I have my own reservations with the term global majority, because it's also a majority. You always assume that you're speaking on behalf of a majority, where this is the whole idea is that it's majority of the world, right? And you cannot just lump the majority of the world together and say that we're representing all their views and speaking on behalf of all their views. So the term itself is not representative. But and tied to that is exactly this point that with everybody retreating to their own national contexts, you cannot talk about these issues in a harmonized way anymore. And also because everyone with the AI development stance has become so fragmented, and everyone has their own track that they're charting. So it's become very difficult to speak on behalf, or even say that there's a united voice anymore. So that's one thing. And about the interoperability of the internet, I think it's in big danger right now. I mean, also with the GDC you mentioned and business process, US is pulling out of a lot of UN bodies. And then that has given this vacuum it's created. Obviously, there's a huge dominance by China in this space, especially in the UN context. And China has obviously been the longest critical voice of interoperability of the internet. So this definition of the internet itself being open and interoperable is has always been, I think, in the past few years under threat, but now even more so because within the UN space is the forum where people were pushing for it. Also, the language within GDC. Now we have IGF coming next week. We will see where this conversation goes. It's a critical year for that issue, but I think it's become very threatened because the UN has become very weak as well.
And one follow up on this point, Ramsha, because we're talking about these multi stakeholder conversations. One criticism, and I think it's a valid criticism, is that a lot of these conversations have not, unfortunately, been truly multi stakeholder, right? From as
Yeah.
global south researchers, we've said that uh, the global south research community hasn't gotten enough representation in these multi-stakeholder conversations that decide the broad consensus on digital technologies globally. Countries like India have said that the US has dominated these conversations.
Yeah.
It's not truly sort of multi-stakeholder from our perspective. As researchers who care about the multi-stakeholder coalition, we're impacted by the space we're given and that's held for us as increasingly the world is moving to multilateral and country-to-country conversations. I wanted to really pick your brain, because you're speaking to people across the world. What have you been hearing about the future of multi-stakeholderism, and what do you feel as well? I want to sort of encourage your perspective.
It's become very hard. It was being, truly having a multi-stakeholder space, I think is very, very difficult. And even to have everyone in the same room and ensuring everyone gets to have an equal say is even more difficult. So there will always be those power dynamics playing in the multi. What's happened now, things have become more multilateral, I would say, and less multi-stakeholder. And this is very important because of what IGF is next week versus, I think, the week after. The UN, the process is promoting multi-stakeholderism. The number of civil society groups that can show up to these discussions is also honestly a big question with the funding cuts. And what already there was an issue of representation and equal representation. And now it's become that who is going to be supporting these groups to even show up, or are they going to be making an extra effort to ensure that they're included in these conversations? Honestly, with the way UN is struggling with their own issues, I don't have anything positive to say. But it's a big reality that the civil society sector is really struggling right now, and the work that was going into the space is going to suffer as well. So it's really a big question. Ideally, yes, I'm a big, I do promote multi-stakeholderism, but I just feel that in effect, unless someone steps up to actively support and ensure civil society representation in these spaces, it's not going to be implemented.
Ramsha, we've covered a lot of ground today, and given the number of uncertainties we've talked about, we don't we don't want to ask you to do a neat conclusion, tying everything together. But just before signing off, would you like to look, being where you are, from where you're looking at things, would you just like to tell our listeners some of the big stories that, if they are in the tech policy space, if they are journalists or researchers who are following this space, what are the big stories they should be following? Uh,
Many big. I mean, I'm sure if you're a journalist right now, you're really hoping to get some break. There's no break for anyone. I definitely think geopolitics is an important tech story right now. And that's what we started with actually, how it's no longer just a tech story, because when regulations are being used as a bargaining power between regulators, then it has more consequences and more implications. So the geopolitical implementation of regulations, but also the pushback against regulations is an important story, and that's, I think, also global, because most countries have at this point passed laws against platforms. Number two, I think with what's happening in US, because I do spend a lot of my time looking at what's happening in US because Tech Press is a US publication and focusing on tech and democracy. I sometimes really think of what will happen to what does fight look like in going forward, and what I started with, what is rights respecting? Are there any best practices that we can look at? What is the relevance of this? I think is a big question. So this is obviously a broad topic, but looking into examples of what has worked from other contexts, I think would be tremendously useful before this whole space just dies down because no one is talking about that. So definitely more best practices. What has worked is always difficult to answer, but I do think that we have more experience resisting authoritarianism. So informing what we can inform globally based on those experiences, I think is important.
Thanks, Ramsha, and it's always a delight speaking to you. I could continue speaking to you for an hour more. I'm sure
Yeah.
Fawaz also feels that. But thanks so much for taking out that time. It's been an interesting conversation, and we'll continue to follow the critical work you do and also cite it in our research. Thanks so much.
Oh, no, thank you so much. This has been great. I really appreciate it.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link to details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.